Hey everyone, it's Mr. Wob194. I hope you're doing well today. I have another book review for you from an author that I love tremendously and did not love this book. I was very disappointed with it. This book is Blood on the Page, the complete short fiction of Brian Keene, Volume 1. Brian Keene, of course, is an author that I've talked a lot about here on the channel. Even in reviews that weren't based on one of his books, I've talked about him. By the way, the reason I'm kind of keeping my voice lower, past our time when it comes to the noise ordinance and stuff here at the apartment, so I'm right next door to my neighbor's apartment. I don't want to make too much noise for him. My wife is also trying to sleep in the next room. So, yeah. Anyway, Blood on the Page, the complete short fiction of Brian Keene. It's about 250 pages long, and it is a pretty big letdown, frankly. I'm kind of bummed about it. I'm kind of, I don't know, kind of pissed about it a little bit. I feel like somewhere earlier on in this book that it said something about being listed in chronological order of his writing and publishing of each of these short stories. I'm pretty sure that's what it said. I think there are some in here that have never been published before. I think many of them have been published before. Many of them tie into his current series, like The Rising, that whole franchise of books. There's like 4 or 5 of those now. There's also ones that tie into certain books that he's had out, like Jack's Magic Beans has a couple of stories in here. Jack's Magic Beans, the actual story, is not in here from Jack's Magic Beans, the anthology, but some of the other stories, like I Am the Exit or whatever, are in here. There's quite a few stories you probably read if you're a big Brian Keene fan and read Jack's Magic Beans, for example. That is the only other short story collection I've read of his, and that was mostly an okay book. Jack's Magic Beans, the actual story in Jack's Magic Beans, the actual anthology, was the best part of that whole book. Now, my favorites are, my personal favorite is Darkness on the Edge of Town. I think it's a phenomenal, very kind of H.P. Lovecraft type of read. I love Brian Keene's writing style there. I love The Rising. I love City of the Dead. I haven't read the other 2 books yet, or 3, whatever's there for the rest of the Rising series. I know Brian Keene typically gets a lot of trash for being compared to being more amateur than most horror writers out there. And in some cases with this book, I actually agree with that. There's a lot of stories in here. If this is a lot of stuff that he wrote for the first time ever in his life or short fiction, I would agree a lot of it, if I'm correct, and if the book does say somewhere in there that it's published in chronological order of publication or whatever, it does come across to me as a person kind of growing into their writing and into their authorship and into their style and all of those things. I personally believe that with this book. I think it's very obvious with a lot of stuff I've seen in here. And frankly, I'd say the first 100 pages of this 250-page book are completely awful. I mean, just nothing redeeming about them. You can see the interest of concept ideas and stuff like that, but the guy who's writing Darkness on the Edge of Town and The Rising isn't touching this type of thing. There are some interesting things done in here, too. It's not a complete loss of time. It's not a complete waste of time. I find that even the worst books from my favorite writers out there, which Brian Keene is one of my favorite writers, probably my top 5 horror writers of all time, I think personally that you can find interest in seeing where they started at. To encourage you, especially if you're someone like myself who wants to be a writer for a living, and you can find a lot of encouragement in seeing where someone actually started off with in their earliest pieces of work, and what they did to improve, and how they improved, and what they did to do that and accomplish that. This is a great example of a book that really taught me that lesson with Brian Keene. I'm used to seeing some really hardcore, fast-paced, gory, crazy stuff. And there's some gore in here, there's some fast-paced stories in here, but a lot of this is just really bad short stories, man. I mean, really, honestly, I mean that. And I hate to say it like that. And Brian Keene, if you ever come around and watch this video or something, I'm telling you, man, it's not against you. Love your books, man. Just this one's not good. This is the worst one I've read from him, personally. Jack's Magic Beans isn't much better than this book, but that first story, Jack's Magic Beans, in that anthology, is great. It really is. It's a great story. I'd love to see that be turned into a movie. I think a lot of stories in here actually have the potential to be a good movie or a short film or anything like that. I won't hold on too long about the bad stories. I kind of want to, I guess, gently mention some of them, and then I'll go on to the good stories that really, I think, are worth picking this book up for, even though I got it on Kindle. If I could find it in hardcover or paperback, I'd buy it, probably. I don't know if it's on Amazon or not, but I'm not going to bother checking right now. But I am a Brian Keene collector, so it's probably going to happen. Anyway, so there's some really bad stories in here. Really, really bad stories in here. And many of them that are bad are typically written very amateurish, like I said. It's one of those few examples I've seen of Brian Keene so far that prove that some of the people who say that about him are right. They can be. I think personally the worst story in here was one that was written for a political anthology of left, right, and middle people, all that stuff. And it was called like Revelation of One, Revolution of One, something like that, and it sucked. It was just Brian Keene rambling on. It wasn't really a horror story. It wasn't really a story at all. It was just somebody rambling and whining nonstop for like 4 pages long. Imagine your uncle that loves politics coming to Thanksgiving and talking nonstop about how great his ideas are over both political parties. That's basically what this whole book was like at that point for that particular story. And that was awful. I couldn't stand it. It was clear-cut the worst thing Brian Keene has put out. Now, I did learn some interesting things about Brian Keene, because there are author notes for every single story in here. So even the ones like that, and learning more and more, Brian Keene loves to hunt, I guess, because there's a lot of stuff referencing hunting and guns and that kind of stuff too. So he is seeming to me more like a southern fellow like myself, which is interesting because I don't see a lot of horror writers that are like that. Richard Lehman is probably the closest to them, but he wasn't really a southerner as far as I know. But even so, Brian Keene is my Richard Lehman of 2021. That's my personal feelings on that. I know it's probably blasphemy to a lot of other Lehman fans out there, but that's how I feel personally when it comes to Keene himself. I really enjoy him. I think he's got a great talent. I think he's doing better and better with everything he puts out. The stories in here, like that political one I just talked about, they typically don't go beyond the quality of that. For the first half of the book, like I said, the first 100 pages, 150 pages are rough, man. And a lot of people that are not Brian Keene fans, if you're reading this book as your first ever Brian Keene book, please, trust me, do not make this the last thing you read of his. Please pick up an actual book. Even if you like short stories better, pick up an actual book. His books are typically short, somewhere between 250 to 300 pages long for his novels and novellas, and I love that. That's great stuff. It flies by, it's enjoyable. It's tense, it's crazy, it's hectic. He really knows how to keep the pace going. You won't get bored reading his stuff as a novel. He doesn't put in any kind of crap that doesn't need to be there. He doesn't bloat out the story like I see too many authors do, which bugs me all the time. This is a great example of a man who I think, and this is a personal belief of mine, I think there are people out there who are better at writing short stories for their authorship, people who are better at writing novels for their authorship. Brian Keene, I suspect, is better at writing novels than short stories. He's good at short stories. Sometimes the later the book goes on, he definitely hits home run after home run, I would say. But many people out there like Stephen King do a better job with short stories than novels. And when they hit their novels, they can have some really good ones out there, but most of the time they're not. And it's an idea of bloat. That's my biggest issue, is bloat. I think everybody has an issue with that, even if they don't know they have an issue with that. Eventually you read enough Stephen King, you see a lot of bloat and it bothers you. Mayberry's kind of hitting that point now too. Jonathan Mayberry's doing a lot of that same exact thing with even his short stories sometimes. But even so, I think Keene is a better novelist than he is a short story writer, so that should tell you much. But there's 3 of these books for these Brian Keene short works of fiction collections, so I have the other 2 on my Kindle. So eventually at some point I'll get around to trying to talk about that for you guys and give you my thoughts. I hope that if I'm right, and if I'm not crazy and it is written in chronological order, or published, posted here, listed, whatever, in chronological order, then those books should definitely be better, the way this book ended. Let's see, so some of the other terrible stories, there was one about, like, a guy named Joe and his wife/girlfriend, they're both drug addicts and they're homeless. Her name is Mary, and the angel Gabriel comes down to them and goes into their tent to have sex with Mary to encourage the apocalypse. And it's supposed to tie into some book or series that Keene is doing. Whatever. There's another story that I talked about that was in Jack's Magic Beans called, I believe it was called I Am the Exit. And then there's a sequel to that story immediately after, either called I Am an Exit or something like that. They're exit stories. There's a killer calling himself the Exit. Reminds me a lot of Riders on the Storm, the Doors song. And I will say this too. A lot of Brian Keene stories in here are focused mainly on just serial killers. There's some stuff in here. There's one particular story later on in the book that's actually pretty decent that reminds me very much of Lehman, and then Brian Keene, when you read the author's note that he attached to each story, on that particular one, he says the same thing I was thinking. That feels like a Lehman story, and he was satisfied with it, even though it was like 7 pages long, you know? There was some really interesting things in here, but I think there's more misses a lot of the time. But when it's good, it's great. It really is. I know I'm not trying to, like, fanboy over Brian Keene. I'm just saying it's true, though. My personal, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the good stuff. My personal favorite story in here has to do with a bunch of people who, basically a bunch of brothers who have a dad who's dying of cancer. And they go into the woods, into a place that they've rented out, a cabin that they have. I don't know if they own it or if they rent it out or whatever. And they bring a family friend or 2. And as they're there, it's tying into Dark Hollow and Ghost Walk, which are kind of a duology of books that Brian Keene wrote many years ago. I have a couple of copies of those. I've never read those books. I'm hoping the story didn't ruin too much about the woods outside in Dark Hollow or whatever. I don't think it did. There's a lot of stories tied to those in this overall book, this anthology. But I hope they didn't spoil too much. I don't think they did, but you know, I never know. But hopefully the books are still good. I'm sure they will still be good, because it's Keene, and I love Keene. I noticed that the story in here that I'm talking about involves the woods coming to life and trees trying to kill everybody that went hunting out there, but there's also a group of teenagers that are trying to, you know, use air horns and stuff to scare the deer away so that the deer can't be shot by the hunting family. And it was a great story. It was like 60 or 50 pages long, and it was fantastic. I loved it. It was one of my favorite stories, if not my very favorite in the entire book. I thought it had so much going for it. It was fun, it was crazy, it was wild, had a lot of gore in there, some really unique kills that would be awesome in a movie. I'm telling you, dude, if Brian Keene doesn't stick with novel stuff or short story stuff, he should go into screenplays. He should. He has great concepts. He could really improve Hollywood with a lot of his values and the things that he writes a certain way. I think he could do things really cool with the kind of concepts he has. I'm surprised there's not more things adapted to film by Hollywood or indies or anything like that. I know Ghoul was adapted. I haven't read that book, but I know it was adapted at some point. I don't know. I think Brian Keene would be a fantastic person to make movies and stuff off of. I mean, I know he's not well known, but his content is fantastic. I really think people would really accept this, especially the horror fans out there who love movies and only movies. They don't read books. They're missing out on people like Brian Keene and people like Jonathan Mayberry when he was still doing horror. They're missing out on people like that who are doing something really cool, really fun and experimental and all those things. And it bums me out because there needs to be more exposure for people like Brian Keene. Anyway, there was another story in here too. I think it was the last story of the book about a guy who shits gold. Yes. He shits gold. He always has since he was a baby. And people around him try to exploit him all the time. It's kind of like this idea, almost in a weird metaphorical way, of like child stars. You know, people like Amanda Bynes, Britney Spears, now that that's trending. And it was a very interesting tale, and I really liked how Keene went about that. And I even liked the ending to it. The ending was very clever there. Would have made a really good short film. It really would have. It would have been weird, but it would have been a cool one. There's some really good stories here. I know there's at least a couple I'm forgetting about, too. There's one that's kind of controversial, and me as a Christian, it was a little weird. By the way, I think Brian Keene has quite a bit of history in being some kind of church person. I think he was probably more something like Mormon or Jehovah's Witness if I had to bet on it, but he mentioned at one point having a Schofield reference Bible, and that completely blew my mind on one of his characters, because most writers don't even know about that. Most Christians don't even know about that book, so that's pretty interesting, seeing the Schofield reference Bible, which is mostly used by Baptists. That's why I'm just kind of a little confused on what Brian Keene might be or what he's exposed to, but he knows about a Schofield Bible, so that's kind of interesting. I don't have a Schofield, don't really want one either as a Christian, but still, Brian Keene has a lot of interesting ideas on how he views Christianity specifically. And when you see some of the ways like that Mary and Joe, homeless drug addict story with the angel Gabriel, seeing some of the things that he says in his stories about Christianity are kind of, I wouldn't say offensive, because I believe in free speech. I guess they are offensive, but at the same time it's more of, they're wrong? You know, just not even just clear cut as, oh, I disagree with them. It's like factoids in the Bible that are completely dead wrong. You know what I mean? Like, it's, I don't know. It seems like somebody who was told what to say and think, not actually thinking it through, actually reading the Bible for themselves. That's just how it comes across to me. But Brian Keene comes across as a smart guy, in my opinion. I think that his interest in guns is very fascinating to me. You don't see that a lot in horror writers either. I don't know, I found it kind of cool, but then you have one of the stories in here that are written to be like a different version of the story of Lazarus, but it's written as if you're reading kind of a KJV type of tale, you know? And it involves tying itself into The Rising, that particular series of books that I mentioned, and I really enjoy those books. Of course, the way those books work, they're about the zombie apocalypse, but it's actually demons possessing dead carcasses of people, and animals too, I believe, but even so. Yeah, demon possession is how zombies work in that world of Brian Keene's creation there. However, in this book, it's I don't know, it's supposed to be a reference to that, involving Lazarus and Jesus, of course, and the disciples and so on and so on. As a Christian, there's part of me that's the natural man, the sinner, and then there's the saved, born-again man on the inside. The saved, born-again man inside of me says, this is wrong, you probably shouldn't enjoy this as much as you do. The outside, natural man, the sinner, says, this is an interesting way of telling that tale in your own little fantasy-like way. It was interesting. I gotta be honest with you. Blasphemous, but interesting. So there's a lot of stuff in here that Brian Keene is doing with more of a religious theme to them that was interesting, or even anti-religious theme for that matter, that I thought was still interesting. I didn't find it entirely just plain cut offensive just to be offensive. And you see that a lot in extreme horror. Brian Keene is a little bit more clever, I would say, about that kind of thing, and he does it slightly better than other people do. So there is appeal in here for a lot of stories. He's probably not going to appeal to all of you guys for everything that you see in here, but there's even other stories in here. One of my other favorites that I forgot about, too, is something about, I think it's called Marriage Causes Cancer in Rats, or something like that. It's about a guy who killed his family. He works in retail as like a store manager or general manager or something. And as he works in this place, the guilt starts getting to him. He was also cheating on his wife before he killed her. And that was a cool story. I really like how that turned out. Again, another great example of a film idea, or a story idea for a short film or something like that. That's a cool concept, and it actually turns out pretty well how he does that story. There's some good stuff in here. I think there's just a lot of misses. When probably half of your book is almost unreadable, that's not a good thing, man. Now, like I said, if you make it through the first half, then you'll be pretty good. I think you'll enjoy a lot of the stuff in here. Just please, for the love of God, if you come across this review, do not make this your first Brian Keene book. Pick up The Rising, pick up City of the Dead immediately after you pick up The Rising, because they both tie right directly together. Pick up Darkness on the Edge of Town, which is my personal favorite. Like I said, that's where you're really going to get a lot of cool, interesting storytelling from this guy who can write novels at a very fast, brisk pace that actually makes you want to care about it and be involved with that story and care about what's happening with these characters. Short stories are not for Brian Keene, at least not right now, in my opinion. It's going to be a while till I pick up that second and third book and actually read those, because this was a rough one, man. It took me a couple of days to get through this one when I was reading it, because it ain't great. It's not a great one. Anyway, Blood on the Page, the complete short fiction of Brian Keene, Volume 1. It is not a perfect book by any means. Definitely not one of my favorites of Brian Keene. Probably the worst I've read of his so far. Again, even compared to Jack's Magic Beans, that's not a perfect book either. I'd probably rate it about the same as this, but I consider this lower than that book. But the story about the trees, great story. I really enjoyed that. When it comes to Blood on the Page, if I had to rate this book on a 5-star basis, I'd probably give it about probably a 3 out of 5 stars. I kind of almost wanted to give it a 2, because there's not enough in here to really push people to want to pick it up. But it's really about the entertainment value for me. How much did I actually enjoy this? And it was pretty wishy-washy, you know, and I got to that second half and it was just nonstop. I bombed through that in like a day because it was great. But that first half, that took a long time to get through, man. It was not good. Anyway, what do you think about Brian Keene's Blood on the Page? Do you love this book? Do you hate it? Do you think he's a better short story writer than author for novels? What do you think about it? I'd love to hear all that down below, guys, and hear what you have to say about it. I am very disappointed with this book. It's a shame, you know, frankly. I feel like there should have been more here, and there wasn't. And that's okay, but half of the book was really bad. Like, really bad. Like, unpublishable bad. That says a lot about the publishers you're seeing in here that had put this out, you know? I don't know, I'm not trying to be mean, it's just the truth. Anyway, what are your thoughts, guys? Put your thoughts and comments down below. Thank you for watching. 3 out of 5 stars for me. God bless you guys. Goodbye.